I used to believe that being right was the same thing as being strong, and it took me most of my life to understand how much that belief cost me. My name is Margaret Lewis. I am 84 years old, and I want to tell you about the marriage where I won every argument and slowly lost the closeness I thought would always be there. When I was young, I learned early that words were how you survived. I grew up in a house where silence meant you were overlooked and hesitation meant you were dismissed. So I became quick with my thoughts and quicker with my voice. By the time I met my husband, Henry, I could defend an opinion the way some people defend their homes. I didn't call it defensiveness back then. I called it knowing who I was. Henry was different from me in ways that felt comforting at first. He spoke carefully, paused before answering, and sometimes chose not to say anything at all. When we were dating, I mistook his quiet for depth, and in many ways it was. He listened with his whole face. He remembered small things. He never tried to outshine anyone. Being with him felt like stepping out of noise and into something steadier. Our first arguments came early, as they do in most relationships, and I remember feeling oddly energized by them. I liked the clarity of disagreement, the way it sharpened my thinking. Henry would make a point, I would counter it, and I could feel myself gaining ground with every sentence. He wasn't weak, but he was fair, and fairness can look like surrender when one person is determined to win. When he finally said, "All right, you've convinced me," I felt a small glow of satisfaction that I didn't question. In the early years of our marriage, I told myself that arguing meant we cared. We were building a life, deciding where to live, how to spend money, whose career took priority when choices had to be made. I came prepared to those conversations with reasons and projections and memories of what had worked before. Henry came with instincts and feelings that didn't always fit neatly into a debate. I thought instincts were unreliable. I thought feelings needed structure. So I gave them both structure, whether he asked for it or not. What I didn't see then was that every argument has an aftertaste. Even when things seem resolved, something lingers. In our case, what lingered was imbalance. Henry almost always adapted to my conclusions. I almost never adapted to his uncertainty. I told myself that meant I was decisive, that I was carrying the mental load. I didn't notice that the load was being shared less and less. When our children arrived, life grew louder and fuller, and the cracks between us were easy to ignore. There were diapers and school schedules and dinners to plan. We disagreed about parenting the same way we disagreed about everything else. I researched, I reasoned, I explained. Henry listened, offered a thought or two, and then stepped back. I told myself someone had to steer, and I was good at steering. I didn't ask myself what it meant that he no longer reached for the wheel. There was a moment, years later, that returns to me often now. Our youngest was still small, and Henry mentioned that he worried he was too soft with the children. He said it tentatively, like a thought he wasn't sure deserved air. I immediately reassured him by explaining why his softness wasn't practical, why consistency mattered more, why my approach made more sense. He nodded, smiled faintly, and said nothing more. I remember feeling relieved that I had settled his worry. I didn't notice that I had also settled his voice. As the years passed, our marriage became efficient. We ran the household smoothly. We coordinated holidays and family visits. Friends admired our stability. People said we balanced each other well, and I agreed with them. I thought balance meant that one of us leaned where the other stood firm. I didn't consider the possibility that balance could also mean meeting in the middle. Our conversation shifted slowly, the way most lasting changes do. They became shorter, more practical. Henry stopped bringing me problems unless they needed solving. He stopped sharing half-formed ideas. If he disagreed, he did it gently, briefly and without much insistence. I told myself that was maturity, that we had moved beyond unnecessary conflict. I didn't ask whether he still felt invited to speak freely. One evening, when we were both nearing 60, Henry said something that startled me. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, the house quiet in that way it only gets once children are grown. He said almost casually that he sometimes felt lonely even when we were together. The word lonely landed hard. It felt unfair. It felt inaccurate. I responded the way I always did when something felt wrong. I explained why it couldn't be true. I reminded him of our shared routines, our history, our long marriage. I pointed out how much time we spent together, how much we had built. I told him loneliness didn't make sense in the life we had. By the time I finished, he looked tired. He apologized for bringing it up and said he must have been having an off day. I accepted that explanation without question. I thought the matter was settled. That was the last time Henry spoke to me about feeling lonely. After that conversation, something subtle shifted. Henry didn't withdraw in any dramatic way. He didn't grow cold or distant. He simply became more contained. He filled his time with solitary comforts, books, walks, small projects that didn't require discussion. He was still kind, still dependable, still my husband in every visible sense. I told myself that long marriages naturally quiet down, that not everything needs to be talked through. I didn't notice that the quiet wasn't shared equally. When Henry became ill, it happened faster than either of us expected. One diagnosis led to another, and suddenly our days were filled with appointments and decisions. I stepped into the role I knew best. I organized, questioned, planned. I became his advocate, his voice in medical rooms where he felt overwhelmed. Henry trusted me completely. He always had. That trust felt like proof that our marriage had been strong all along. During those months, though, there were moments when Henry looked at me with an expression I couldn't name at the time. It wasn't anger, it wasn't blame, it was something quieter, almost resigned. One afternoon, when his energy was low and his voice even lower, he said, "I think we talked past each other a lot." He said it gently, like an observation rather than a complaint. My first instinct was to respond, to clarify what he meant, to explain our history the way I always had. But something in his tone stopped me. For once, I didn't rush to make sense of it. I didn't argue. I just held his hand and let the thought sit between us, unfinished. I didn't realize then how rare that moment was, or how late it had come. Henry died on a quiet morning that didn't feel like it belonged to endings. After the funeral, after the calls and visits faded, I was left alone in a house that suddenly felt enormous. Silence filled every room. Without conversations to manage, I began to hear the ones we had never truly had. I replayed our arguments, not word for word, but in feeling. Me leaning forward, him leaning back, me concluding, him conceding. In that silence, I began to understand something that had eluded me for decades. I hadn't been protecting our marriage by winning arguments. I had been protecting myself. I had been afraid of being wrong, afraid of uncertainty, afraid that if I didn't explain everything clearly enough, I would disappear, the way people did in my childhood home. Henry had paid the price for that fear by becoming smaller in our conversations, and eventually in our emotional life together. Grief has a way of sharpening your vision. Without Henry there to adapt to me, I finally saw the shape of our marriage clearly. It wasn't cruel or unloving. It was simply unbalanced. I had mistaken agreement for closeness and quiet for peace. I didn't understand that intimacy needs room to be awkward, to be unresolved, to allow both people to remain fully themselves. People told me I had been a good wife. They said no marriage is perfect, that we had shared a long life, that love looks different with time. I nodded and thanked them, but inside I was learning a harder truth. Love can survive many things, but it struggles when one voice consistently outweighs the other. I had not meant to silence Henry. I had simply never learned how to listen without preparing a response. I am 84 years old now, and I see my younger self with a tenderness I couldn't manage then. She wasn't trying to dominate. She was trying to feel safe. But safety built on winning is fragile, and it leaves very little room for the people you love to stand beside you as equals. After Henry was gone, the days stretched in unfamiliar ways. There was no one to check plans with, no small negotiations about dinner or errands or how to spend an afternoon. At first, I filled the time the way I always had, by organizing it. I kept busy. I made lists. I stayed productive. But eventually there were hours that resisted structure, and in those hours, memories surfaced without my permission. I began to remember moments I had dismissed at the time. The way Henry used to start a sentence and then stop, as if reconsidering whether it was worth finishing. The way he would say, "Never mind," with a small smile, and how often I let that smile reassure me instead of troubling me. I remembered how rarely he contradicted me in front of others, and how proud I had been of our unity, never wondering what it cost him to maintain it. Living alone taught me something arguments never had. Without another person adjusting around me, I felt the edges of my own habits more sharply. I noticed how quickly I formed conclusions, how uncomfortable I still felt sitting with uncertainty. I realized that Henry had been absorbing that discomfort for both of us, smoothing things over by retreating. What I had called calm had been his accommodation. There were moments when regret arrived suddenly and without drama. I would be washing dishes or folding laundry, and a memory would surface, an argument about something small, a purchase, a visit, a decision that no longer mattered. I would remember how easily I had pushed my point, how readily he had stepped aside. Those moments didn't feel devastating. They felt heavy, like carrying something long after you realize you don't need it anymore. I started to understand that winning arguments had given me a sense of control, not connection. Control feels comforting when you're afraid of being overlooked. It creates order. It reduces unpredictability. But love, I learned too late, thrives on a different kind of safety. The safety of being able to speak without preparing a defense. The safety of knowing your feelings won't be corrected out of existence. Henry had offered me that safety again and again. I had offered him solutions instead. As I grew older, friends began to confide in me more openly. Long marriages tend to invite that. People assume you have wisdom simply because you have lasted. I listened to women talk about frustrations, about feeling unheard, about arguments that never seemed to resolve anything. I heard myself in their words, sometimes as the person feeling silenced, sometimes as the person doing the silencing. I resisted the urge to advise them the way I once would have. Instead, I asked questions. I let them finish. Listening felt different at this age. It felt slower, less purposeful. It didn't lead anywhere neat, and yet it felt closer to what I had always wanted without knowing how to ask for it. I don't believe Henry would have wanted me to punish myself with regret. He was not that kind of man. What he would have wanted, I think, is for me to understand, to see clearly even if late, and to use that understanding gently, not just on myself but on others. If there is one thing I wish I had known earlier, it is this. Arguments are rarely about the subject at hand. They are about fear, about being seen, about whose inner world gets taken seriously. When I argued with Henry, I wasn't just defending opinions. I was defending my place, my worth, my voice. But I already had those things. I just didn't trust that I could keep them without fighting. I used to think that compromise meant someone losing ground. Now I see that real compromise is something else entirely. It's the willingness to stay present even when you don't understand, to let the other person's experience exist without immediately reshaping it to fit your own logic. That kind of patience doesn't feel powerful in the moment. It feels vulnerable. But vulnerability is where intimacy lives. Sometimes I imagine a different version of my marriage, not perfect, not free of conflict, but gentler in its disagreements. I imagine myself asking Henry, "Tell me more," instead of, "Here's why that doesn't make sense." I imagine leaving some conversations unfinished, trusting that we didn't need resolution to remain connected. I don't linger there long. Imagined pasts can become their own kind of trap. But I allow myself to see what might have been, because it helps me understand what still can be for others. If you are listening to me now, I don't know where you are in your life. You might be young and full of certainty, or older and tired of repeating the same conversations. You might be in a marriage or missing one, or wondering whether yours is slowly becoming quieter in ways you can't explain. I won't tell you to stop arguing. I won't tell you to give up your clarity or your convictions. I will tell you this. Pay attention to who speaks less over time. Pay attention to who adapts more. Pay attention to whether peace is being created together or maintained by one person stepping back. Those patterns form quietly, and once they settle in, they feel normal, even when they are slowly hollowing something out. I am 84 years old, and I understand now that love is not proven by how well you defend your position, but by how safe you make it for someone else to reveal theirs. If I could have one more evening with Henry, I would not spend it explaining or persuading or settling anything at all. I would sit across from him, let the conversation wander, let silences stretch without filling them, and trust that being together was reason enough to stay. That is the argument I wish I had learned how to lose.